What is our exit strategy? Same old questions, no answers. He closed by saying this: what do we say to the mother and father, the wife of the last Marine killed, to support a corrupt government and a corrupt leader in a war that cannot be won? I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlelady from Florida, do you seek further recognition?
My good friend, the gentleman from California, if we could have 2 minutes of his time, we
yes,
would be so
yield,
grateful.
If the gentlelady will yield, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 2 minutes of my remaining time to my chairman.
Thank you.
Without objection, the gentlelady from Florida may control that time.
If I could ask, how much time then would we have to close?
The gentlelady from Florida has 5.5 minutes.
Great. And we will reserve right now.
Who seeks, the gentlelady reserves, who seeks recognition? Seeing none, we'll proceed with the closing statements in the reverse order of the opening statements. First, the gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman has 3.5 minutes.
I yield that time to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich. Thank you.
The gentleman is recognized for 3.5 minutes.
The 2001 authorization of military force and the justification for our continued military presence in Afghanistan is that the Taliban in the past provided a safe haven for al-Qaeda, or could do so again in the future. General Petraeus has already admitted that al-Qaeda has little or no presence in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is an international organization, and yes, they're a threat to America. The Taliban is only a threat to us as long as we continue our military occupation in Afghanistan. After more than 9 years of military occupation of Afghanistan, can we really continue to claim to be acting in self-defense? The premise that the presence of our troops on the ground keeps us safer at home has been repudiated by recent terrorist attacks on the United States, all done by people other than Afghans, outraged at continuing U.S. military occupation of predominantly Muslim countries. That's not to justify what they do, but it is to clarify the condition that we have in Afghanistan. For how long are we going to continue to dedicate hundreds of billions of dollars and thousands of lives before we realize we can't win Afghanistan militarily? At the end of the year, the administration and U.S. military leaders were touting peace talks to end the war with high-level Taliban leaders. These Taliban leaders turned out to be fake. A November 2010 article in the New York Times detailed joint U.S. and Afghan negotiations with Mullah Akhtar Mohammad Mansour, a man the U.S. claimed was one of the most senior commanders in the Taliban. According to the New York Times, the episode underscores the uncertain and even bizarre nature of the atmosphere in which Afghan and American leaders search for ways to bring the American-led war to an end. The leaders of the Taliban are believed to be hiding in Pakistan, possibly with the assistance of the Pakistani government, which receives billions of dollars in U.S. aid, unquote. How can we claim that a cornerstone of our counterinsurgency strategy is to take out Taliban strongholds across the country, while at the same time conducting negotiations with the Taliban in an effort to end the war? This episode further underlines our significant weakness in our strategy. We think we can separate the Taliban from the rest of the Afghan population. Our counterinsurgency strategy fails to recognize a basic principle: occupations fuel insurgencies. Occupations fuel insurgencies. Occupations fuel insurgencies. The Taliban is a local resistance movement that is part and parcel of the indigenous population. We lost the Vietnam War because we failed to win the hearts and minds of the local population without providing them with a competent government that provided them with basic security and a decent living. We're committing the same mistake in Afghanistan. News reports indicate the Taliban is regaining momentum. The increase in civilian casualties due to higher levels of violence by insurgents further undermines the assurances of progress. As we send more troops into the country and kill innocent civilians with errant airstrikes, the Taliban gains more support as resistors of foreign occupation. If we accept the premise that we can never leave Afghanistan until the Taliban is eradicated, we'll be there forever. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record an article from The Nation America's failed war in Afghanistan, no policy change is going to affect the outcome. That's by Jeremy Scahill.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent to put into the record an article from AlJazeera.net which points out that for all practical purposes, Washington has given up on its counterinsurgency strategy.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record from Alternet articles by Derek Crow and Robert Greenwald posted on February 6, 2011, that state there's a damning new report that shows the U.S. strategy is blocking a chance for peace in Afghanistan.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent to place into the record an article from ABC News that says Afghan security is the worst in a decade, according to the UN.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I'm asking unanimous consent to place into the record an article from the New York Times discussing the counterintelligence strategy, which says the U.S. is pulling back in the Afghan Valley it called vital for the war.
Without objection, so ordered.
How much time do I have left out of this 3.5 minutes?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Okay, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California has 7.5 minutes.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, as I understand that these are closing
Correct.
statements. Well, then I simply would very quickly make the case that this resolution should be voted against for several reasons. Initially, because it improperly invokes a provision of the War Powers Act that's inapplicable. This war was authorized by the U.S. Congress. Secondly, that the manner in which this would force a withdrawal is irresponsible and I don't think is the right way to do it. And thirdly, that I am not prepared at this point of view to say that failure is in any way inevitable and that we should not at this time make the judgment to pull the plug out from what we are doing in Afghanistan. I would urge no vote for the resolution. I yield back the entire balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Ohio has 5 1/4 minutes.
How much, Mr. Speaker?
5 1/4 minutes.
Thank you. We've stated over and over in this debate the cost of this war. In this budget alone, it will be over $113 billion. $113 billion. There are members who have come to this floor trying to whack $1 billion in spending here and there. This is $113 billion. You want to cut out waste, let's get out of Afghanistan. Keep in mind that when you go to the Pentagon, and some of our members have and have gone to Afghanistan, there's an open-ended war going on here. There's no end in sight. I've submitted to the record articles with respect to that. We're going to be there, hear this, we're going to be there through at least 2020. And that's going to cost us at least an extra $1 trillion. Where are we going to get that money? Are we going to cut Social Security for that? Are we going to cut health care and cut funds for education? Are we going to cut more funds for home heating aid? Where are we going to get this money? Are we ready to give up our entire domestic agenda so that we can continue on the path of a war to prop up a corrupt regime whose friends are building villas in Dubai, presumably with money that comes through the United States, that's shipped out in planes out of the Kabul airport? We have to start standing up for America here. I appreciate and respect every member of this Congress who served in the military. We honor them, just as I honor the members of my own family. My father, Frank, who was a World War II veteran. My brother, Frank, who was a Vietnam veteran. My brother, Gary, a Vietnam-era veteran. My sister, Beth Ann, a Army veteran. I come from a family that appreciates service to our country. But how are we serving our troops? By letting them in a situation that is absolutely impossible, where there's greater numbers of them returning home with injuries from IEDs. How are we serving our troops? By telling them we're going to keep extending the period of the war. Who's speaking up truly for our troops here? Is it General Petraeus, who says, well, we'll just keep the war going and maybe we'll send 2,000 troops out of Afghanistan or redirect them by 2014. He doesn't get to make the choice. That choice must be made by the Congress of the United States. It's time that we started to stand up for the Constitution of the United States, which, last I checked, in Article 1, Section 8, provides that Congress has to make the decision whether or not to send our troops into war. We have not the right to give that over to a president, over to a general, or anybody else. This is our prerogative inside this Congress. In 2001, Mr. Speaker, I joined with members of this House in voting for the authorization of military force following the terrorist attacks on 9/11. I don't take a backseat to anyone in standing up to defend this country. But as the United States continues in what is now the longest war in our history, it has become clear that the authorization for military force is being used as a carte blanche for circumventing Congress's role as a co-equal branch of government. I want you to hear this. We're a co-equal branch of government. We're not lapdogs for the president. We're not servants of generals. We are a co-equal branch of government expressing the sovereign will of the American people. It has become clear this administration, just as the last administration, is willing to commit us to an endless war and an endless stream of money. Just for over a year after, a commitment of an additional 30,000 troops to Afghanistan and continued assurances of progress. They've been walking that dog down the road for the last 7 years. Progress. My legislation invokes the War Powers Resolution of 1973, and if enacted, would require this president to withdraw U.S. armed forces out of Afghanistan by December 31st, 2001. Now, regardless of your support or opposition to the war in Afghanistan, this debate has been a critical opportunity to evaluate the human and the economic costs as this Congress works to address our country's dire financial straits. Those of us in support of the withdrawal may not agree on a timeline, but an increasing number of us agree it's time to think and rethink our current national security strategy. And we have to know the costs are great. We can't get away from the costs of this war. Nobel Prize-winning economists Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes, his associate, wrote a book about the Iraq War. They projected then a minimum of $3 trillion in costs. I ask unanimous consent to put into the record, Mr. Speaker, a statement that I made over 8 years ago at the beginning of the Iraq War, where I pointed out there was no reason why we should be going to war in Iraq because there was no proof that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
Without objection, so ordered.
I mention that in terms of this debate because we're at the confluence of events, the anniversary of the Iraq War, the confluence of the funding of the war in Afghanistan. We've got to get out of Afghanistan. We've got to get out of Iraq. We've got to start taking care of things here at home. I yield back.
The gentlelady from Florida has 5.5 minutes to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased and honored to yield the remainder of our time to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. McCotter, member of the Financial Services Committee, a former member of our Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'd like to remind my good friend that we still have a vacancy GOP vacancy in our committee, and we need freedom and democracy believers like Mr. McCotter. Seniority retained.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentlelady. I thank her for her kind words and her attempt to draft me. In this age of hope and peril, today we all assemble with earnestness and sincerity to discuss matters of liberty and tyranny, matters of life and death. When we see in Afghanistan is a counterinsurgency operation being led by the United States. It is the most difficult and most painful type of military operation to witness because it does involve working with the population, winning hearts and minds, and helping to build the institutions of democracy and liberty at the community and national level, which have been non-existent for decades. But because the cause is difficult does not mean we can turn away from it, because the Afghan people cannot turn away from it. In 2006, I was fortunate to be on a CODEL with many of my colleagues, and we had the opportunity to meet women who were serving in the Afghan National Assembly. And despite the difficulties in translation, it was very clear that they wanted to accomplish two things. They wanted to serve the Afghan people who entrusted them with their positions, and they wanted to honor the men and women of the United States military who had risked and given so much for them to have that opportunity. In this debate today, as I said, I deeply appreciate the sincerity and earnestness of this debate because, in this instance, clearly, it is not one based upon partisan division, but one upon the dictates of conscience. But I think it is very important that we look into this situation and see that it is not simply the United States that is involved here, that it is not simply a question of leaving without consequence. Because if we leave now, if we back this resolution, there will be consequences to the female Afghanistan National Assembly parliamentarians who are trying to build freedom within that country. In my discussion with those brave women, they brought up how difficult it was for them, how hard it would be to build a sustainable democracy, to build an economy, to build, in many ways, what we here take for granted. And I said to them it was very important to remember that the United States itself was not always a great national power and a beacon of hope and freedom. That in our darkest days after the revolution, there were many who thought this free republic would fail. There were enemies who sought its destruction. And yet, at the founding time, the people of the United States and their leaders were able to take this nascent democracy and turn it into one that not only secured freedom for itself, but expanded it to others. And I said that within the halls of the United States Congress and within the halls of our institutions, you can see the pictures of founders like Jefferson and Madison hanging from the walls to remind us of what we've endured, what we enjoy, and what we must return. And I told the Afghan National Assembly women that one day their daughters and granddaughters would look down, look up, and see on the walls their portraits hanging in a free Afghanistan that was allied with the free world against terrorism and was a beacon itself to those who were oppressed. Because they will be free, and because we will honor our duty not to seek miserly to hold our own freedom for ourselves, but because we will follow what Lincoln said, in seeking to extend freedom to the enslaved, we ensure freedom for ourselves. We will continue to stand with the Afghan people. We will continue to honor the commitment to the solemn word of the United States that she gave to that country. And one day we will look back and we will be proud for the votes we cast today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady yields back the balance of her
Yes,
time.
sir.
All time for debate is expired. Pursuant to the order of the House of Wednesday, March 26, 2001, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the concurrent resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the concurrent resolution is agreed to.
I ask for the ayes and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings of this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 174, I call up H.R. 1076, a bill to prohibit federal funding of National Public Radio and the use of federal funds to acquire radio content.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1076, a bill to prohibit federal funding of National Public Radio and the use of federal funds to acquire radio content.
Pursuant to House Resolution 174, the bill is considered read. The gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I will consume. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members be given 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks on the legislation and to insert extraneous material on the bill.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 1076, a bill to get the federal government and federal taxpayers out of the business of buying radio programs they do not agree with. This is a bill that is long overdue. Regardless of what you think of NPR, its programming, or statements by its management, the time has come to cut the umbilical cord from the taxpayer support that has become as predictable as an entitlement program. Much has changed, Mr. Speaker, in the media landscape since the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was first created in 1967, followed by its creation of National Public Radio in 1970. Today, we have multiple listening choices. There's analog radio, digital radio, satellite radio, streaming radio over the Internet, and podcasts, both commercial and the self-published variety. Choice and available content is not the problem. If you want to find some content, the only question is where you will find it. In these challenging economic times, committing the taxpayer to fund and support particular content, including content he or she may never listen to, highlights this absurd anachronism of the past. It is time to move forward and let National Public Radio spread its wings and support itself. This legislation does several important things. It prohibits direct federal funding of NPR, National Public Radio, and more importantly, it ensures the American taxpayer will not be funding through their tax dollars radio program from NPR or other outlets with which they may not agree. It is also important to recognize that this bill does not do a few things. It does not defund public radio stations. And I want to repeat that, Mr. Speaker, because I think it is such an important point. It does not defund public radio stations. They still may use federal funding to operate their station or to produce their own programming. Public radio stations may also continue to purchase programming from NPR or other sources, just not with federal taxpayer dollars. And this bill has no impact. I want to repeat that. This bill has no impact on public television. The added benefit of this legislation is that it ensures that if taxpayer dollars are necessary and given to local stations, it will not be used to purchase generic national programming, but instead it can be used to produce local content that actually will meet the needs of the community where these are located. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I want to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 3 minutes. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 1076. This bill will cripple National Public Radio, public radio stations and programming that is vital to over 27 million Americans. We are now voting to deny the public access to one of our nation's most credible source of news coverage. CBO has scored this bill. It does not save a penny. This means that this legislation does not serve any fiscal purpose, but it does serve an ugly ideological one. This legislation is not about reforming NPR. It is about punishing NPR. We've held no hearings on this bill. It didn't get referred to the committee for consideration. It's being handled as if it were an emergency. We don't even know all the facts. But that's apparently no impediment. For decades, decisions on federal support for public broadcasting have been made 2 years in advance to insulate public broadcasting from politically motivated interference. This bill removes that buffer. NPR is now exposed to the full force of the political winds that blow through the House of Representatives. That means the independence and objectivity that public broadcasting has tried so hard to uphold is now subject clearly to political interference. For those who complain that they don't want content to be one way or the other on the political spectrum, but to be honest and fair, the right-wing Republicans are trying to impose their view of what NPR should be saying in the content of their programming. They'll say that's not the case. But, Mr. Speaker, that is the case. There's no reason for this bill. It is vindictive. It is mean-spirited. It's going to hit the smaller stations in rural areas particularly hard. Public radio is indispensable for access to news that's hard to get, especially where broadband service is limited. I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time, and I ask unanimous consent that the gentlelady from State of California, Ms. Eshoo, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Telecommunications, control the rest of our time.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I would like to recognize the author of the legislation, Mr. Lambourne. He is recognized for 5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Madam Blackburn, for your great work that you do on the committee. I introduced H.R. 1076 because the federal government can no longer afford to fund programs that are fully capable of standing on their own. This is not about the ideology of NPR executives or the content that NPR produces, but whether in this age of trillion-dollar annual deficits, taxpayers should subsidize a non-essential entity. Plain and simple, this bill accomplishes 3 things. First, it prohibits public radio stations from using federal funds to purchase programming. Current federal law requires that about 26% of federal grants to public radio stations be used for the production or acquisition of programming. Many stations use these restricted grants to purchase programming from NPR. These programming fees are the largest single source of NPR revenue at $56 million in fiscal year 10. Second, H.R. 1076 prohibits stations from using federal funds to pay NPR dues. In fiscal year 10, over 400 member stations paid a total of $2.8 million in dues to NPR. Third, my bill prohibits direct federal funding of national public radio. For fiscal year 10, NPR received over $5 million in direct funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Departments of Education and Commerce, and the National Endowment for the Arts. These 3 sources of revenues I just described totaled about $64 million in fiscal year 10. Local public radio stations would not be able to use federal tax dollars under this bill to purchase content, whether it's from NPR or any other vendor. However, under this bill, a station could use other dollars for the payment of NPR dues or the acquisition of programming. Should this bill become law, the prohibition of funds would take effect immediately. But the real issue today is the proper role of the federal government with national public radio, and whether government programs and services that can be funded privately should receive taxpayer dollars. We live in an age of digital radio, computerized digital streaming, commercial all-news radio and radio talk shows, many of which are also streamed on the Internet or over satellite radio. And these provide sources of news and opinion without federal taxpayer dollars. NPR should do the same. With the national debt over $13 trillion, the government should simply not continue to fund non-essential services. And this bill is just one step. Long before any firings, videos, and executive comments at NPR, I sponsored legislation in Congress to pull the plug on taxpayer funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, NPR's parent company, as well as NPR. Last year, many of you will remember this issue came up as a U-Cut item, and we voted in support of defunding. Last month, this House passed H.R. 1. Within that bill, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting's unobligated funds for fiscal year 11 would be rescinded. When you couple H.R. 1 with this bill, H.R. 1076, we end taxpayers having to subsidize national public radio. I'm a strong believer in the free market. I'd like to see NPR rework its business model and begin to compete for all of its income. NPR already receives a huge amount of funding from private individuals and organizations through donations and sponsorships. NPR can and should be entirely supported with private sources. In my own state of Colorado, Colorado Public Radio received in fiscal year 10 only 6% of its funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Now, according to this bill, Colorado Public Radio is still permitted to apply for and receive federal grants through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but they cannot use federal money for the NPR dues or purchasing of content. They could use the other 94% of their money to purchase program content. Will this potentially require them to review and reprioritize where money is spent? I'm sure it will. But will it kill its programming? No way. According to NPR, federal funding to supplement operations amounts to less than 2% of its annual budget. Some have said this Congress should not bother with such a small amount of money. Only in Washington would anyone say $64 million is not worth saving. You have to start somewhere if you're truly serious about getting our fiscal house in order. If Congress cannot make difficult decisions in the small areas, how can we even begin to tackle entitlements or other major programs? If we look at the Sting video that has received so much attention, Ron Schiller admits that NPR would be better off without federal funding. There is no need for further debate. NPR does not need taxpayer dollars. We can save a program or we can save our country. Americans want Washington to get serious about ending our overspending. If we can do that, the economy will get better and we'll have less unemployment and more jobs.
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To wrap up, like many Americans, I enjoy much of NPR's programming, but let it live on its own. It can do that simply by changing its business model. Just take the taxpayer out of the equation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Tennessee reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in fierce opposition to this bill, which is going to adversely affect more than 34 million national public radio listeners through 900 local stations across our entire country. My Republican colleagues have declared an emergency to rush this bill to the floor without any hearings whatsoever to examine the proposal. I think that's a bad way to do business. We have many emergencies to deal with in our country, but attacking and crippling NPR is hardly an emergency. What the bill does, and it does it in a very sneaky backdoor way, what the bill does is it cuts off the use of all federal funding to NPR by preventing any grants to it. It prevents any support to NPR by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and it prevents support to NPR programming from public radio stations across the country. In other words, it cripples it, it hobbles it, which is really what
the majority is seeking to do. This proposal is not going to do anything about reducing the deficit. The CBO has weighed in. It doesn't cut any federal spending. In fact, the bill doesn't produce 1 penny in savings. What's very clear is what it does do, and it's really purposeful, and that is to hobble NPR, threatening 9,000 jobs at stations across the country. Why? I think the motivations behind this effort are quite clear. They're rooted in an ideological view about what NPR broadcasts, and it capitalizes on recent headlines involving Ron Schiller and Juan Williams. This attack on NPR strikes at the core of a wide array of NPR programming that Americans enjoy every single day, all week long across the country, from the Diane Rehm show to Morning Edition and to 2 of my favorites, Car Talk and The World of Opera. I acknowledge that our nation faces threats, but Car Talk is hardly one of them, and neither is Diane Rehm. Silencing what some disagree with, make no mistake about it, is a threat to our democracy. A great democracy does not silence voices. We want many voices to the many. NPR programming reaches more than 900 independently owned and operated stations across the country, from San Francisco's KQED, the most listened to public radio station in the country with more than 740,000 listeners each week, to small rural stations like the chairman of the subcommittee, KCUW, in Pendleton, Oregon. These stations provide an important public service to the local community, and people trust it, and they enjoy it, they want it, they like it. This is national programming with local listenership, and NPR's listenership has increased, unlike other stations, by 72% over the last 10 years. And a recent national survey found, and that's why I think this is an ill-begotten proposal by the majority. You say you listen to the American people. I think you have to take the plugs out of your ears. A recent national survey found that almost 70% of all voters across the entire political spectrum oppose terminating the funding for public broadcasting, including 56% of Republicans in the country. So I think it's time to stand up for NPR. I think that this is a phony emergency measure, and I don't think NPR deserves to be treated this way. I urge my colleagues to vote to preserve really what I think is a national treasure that provides in very tough times very clear and important news and information to instruct our country and listeners in local communities around our nation. And with that, I will reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from Tennessee.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 1 minute to the Majority Leader, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cantor.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker. Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Speaker, let's really be honest and talk about what this bill is about. This bill is about making sure that we are spending taxpayer dollars the way that the people that earn them would spend it. And we saw, as the gentlelady from California indicated, on video, executives at NPR saying that they don't need taxpayer dollars. So that's number one. That's out there. That was demonstrated for all of America to see. We are also in the process of making sure that Washington begins to do what every American family and small business person is having to do right now. It's called tightening the belt. It's called trying to learn how to do more with less. And inherently what that means is we've got to start prioritizing the things that are important to the American people. The problem is we've seen NPR and its programming often veer far from what most Americans would like to see as far as the expenditure of their taxpayer dollars. That's the bottom line. Nobody's on a rampage. Nobody is trying to say that we don't like NPR for NPR's sake. We've seen how they spend their money. And so that's why we're saying it's time to prioritize. It's time to reflect the common sense of the American people. And that's why the bill takes the form that it does. It says that we've got to go, number one, listen to the executives at NPR that says that they don't need taxpayer funding. Well, listen, we are all about looking for ways to cut right now and save on both sides of the aisle. We ought to take that advice for what it is. But we also know that NPR takes its funding and benefits from taxpayer dollars through the payments of local stations across the country. So what we're saying by this bill, those stations are not going to be starved from Corporation for Public Broadcasting grants, unlike the lady indicated. What they are going to be told is, you're not going to be using those taxpayer dollars for programming, because we've seen how NPR has used that funding and the kind of programming that has been involved. We're trying to find commonality. Our country is made of much diversity, with people of a lot of differing opinions. Why should we allow taxpayer dollars to be used to advocate one ideology? Why should we? We shouldn't. We should insist that our taxpayer dollars are prioritized and the people's interests of this country are honored. That's why I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to call on our distinguished colleague from our beautiful state of California, Congresswoman Doris Matsui.
For how long does...
For 2 minutes, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding me time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 1076. I can't believe what I'm hearing from the other side of the aisle. It's not a lefty-type organization. This bill would prohibit public radio stations from using federal funds to buy popular programs like Morning Edition, All Things Considered, This American Life. Mr. Speaker, this would be a huge disruption to our nation's public radio system, economy, and most importantly, the intellectual content and news that so many Americans rely upon. According to a recent study, NPR's overall audience grew last year to over 27 million weekly listeners, and that's over 60% overall since 2000. And this is when most other media markets and outlets are struggling. I was a former board chair of Sacramento's local PBS TV station, and I know that I was chairman of a TV station. However, I can attest to the value that national public broadcasting programming offers to my constituents. Mr. Speaker, thousands of my constituents rely on local NPR stations to get their news, and this is a very diverse group. In fact, since this bill was introduced, I've received a significant number of calls from them voicing very strong support for NPR and very, very strong opposition to this legislation. One of my constituents told me that listening to NPR makes him a more informed and certainly more engaged citizen. Moreover, this bill will not produce any savings for the taxpayer and will not reduce the deficit. To my constituents, it's a simple equation of value for money. And also, this is about jobs. We need to talk about jobs. Public radio stations employ over 9,000 workers across the country, including 40 from Sacramento. Mr. Speaker, these are jobs we cannot lose. I urge my colleagues to vote against this harmful legislation. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from California reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I would like to yield 2 minutes to one of our new freshman members, Mr. Crawford from Arkansas, who is a broadcaster and brings that expertise to this chamber.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 1076. As a broadcaster, I understand the importance of the free marketplace, the freedom to express yourself, but to do it on your own merit. I brought an idea to the marketplace to develop a radio news network, started with 4 stations, and within 4 years was able to grow that to 50 stations serving 5 states. I did not ask for one thin dime from the federal government. I think freedom to succeed in this country has to exist also with the freedom to fail. We have an open marketplace. We have an opportunity to sell advertising around the ideas that we express on the radio. I'm a success story in using the open marketplace, the freedom to succeed, but it also comes with the freedom to fail. And earlier in the year, or last year rather, I started a radio station, a small venture. I populated that staff with folks that were on unemployment. So I know what it means to create jobs. And certainly this is not about further burdening our taxpayer with support of an industry that is perfectly capable of supporting itself. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Tennessee reserves the balance of her time, and the gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to now call on Mr. Weiner from New York and also inquire how much time we have on this side. How much time is left?
The gentlelady from California has 21 minutes remaining.
Thank you.
The gentleman from from New York is recognized for...
He's recognized for 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Crisis averted, ladies and gentlemen. What a relief. What a relief. I'm glad we got the economy back going. I'm glad we've secured our nuclear power plants. I'm so glad the Americans are back to work. We finally found out our problem. We discovered a target that we can all agree upon. It's these guys. This is the problem. It's Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers. We're finally getting rid of them. Thank God we solved this problem for the country. Now let's look at the record here. For one, they talk in that Boston accent. Car talk? It's a car. It's a car, ladies and gentlemen. I need to call Congressman Capuano whenever they're on the air. Secondly, they talk about master cylinders and slave cylinders. It's kinky. I am glad my Republican friends are finally getting to the bottom of this. And then with all the giggling and snorting that they do every weekend on their show, it's got to be some kind of a code. They're clearly talking to the Russians or the Chinese or something with all that giggling and snorting. It is fine. I'm so relieved that we had this emergency session, that we waived the rules of the House that require 72 hours, so we finally get these guys off my radio. Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers on Car Talk. I know it. Because these guys, clearly they're political. Well, I don't know if they're political. They make no sense about most of what they say. But you know what? I'm glad we're finally not going to have to listen to them. I'm glad the Republican Party finally said enough of Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers. That clearly was what the American people said in campaign 2010. It's in their contract with America or something, right? Get rid of Click and Clack. It's about time. I have to tell you something, because the last thing we want is informative solutions to how we fix our cars and the Car Talk puzzler. And think about all the people we're finally going to put out of work. You know, their customer care rep. Hey, would you buzz off? I'll tell you how to spell this later, I say to the stenographer. And the director of ethics, you Lion Sack. All of these guys that finally are going to be taken off the public payroll, the Republican Party, no one can say they're not in touch. They get it. They understand where the American people are. The American people are not concerned about jobs or the economy or what's going on around the world. They're staring at their radio saying, get rid of Click and Clack. Finally, my Republican friends are doing it. Kudos to you.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from Tennessee.
I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentlelady from California. The chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they're here as guests of the House and that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of the proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House. Gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'd now like to yield 2 minutes to a highly respected member of the Energy Commerce Committee and the Telecommunications and Internet Subcommittee, Mr. Mike Doyle from Pennsylvania.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry, how long are you yielding? The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today the House Republicans want to eliminate funding for NPR. Some because they think the government shouldn't operate a news service, and some because they think the reporting is biased. I believe they're wrong on both counts. Public radio plays an important role in our communities as a source of news and entertainment. My colleagues should consider the studies that show that NPR listeners are more aware of indisputable facts than viewers and listeners of most other news sources. Opponents of NPR hold up a video hit piece to show that NPR is biased. Even Glenn Beck's website, The Blaze, explains that the video is neither fair nor balanced, how it's basically a lie. And my colleagues should consider the fact that many NPR programs have nothing to do with news or politics. Where's the bias in car talk? There might be a bias against Pintos or Pacers, but not a political bias. Where's the political bias in music broadcast? There might be a bias against Prokofiev, but not a political bias. Even so, if this bill were simply to defund NPR's direct public contribution, then at least it would only impact the organization with the alleged political bias, which is, again, based on a lie. But this bill goes further. It hurts local public radio stations and tens of millions of listeners from across the country. If this bill is enacted, communities across the country will be denied programming that their residents want. Whatever happened to the philosophy that more choice is better? My colleagues, this is bad public policy. This is a terrible bill. This is a terrible waste of our time, and I urge my colleagues to reject it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California reserves the balance of her time.
Does the gentlewoman have speakers?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to clear up what I think is probably a couple of misunderstandings that my colleagues have across the aisle. One of the things I think it's important for everyone in this chamber to realize, and I know some want to make fun of the fact that we're here talking about $100 million, $92 million, $67 million, different funding that goes in and through NPR. Mr. Speaker, every single penny that comes from the taxpayer is important. And every single penny that we appropriate comes from those taxpayers, and we are charged with being good stewards of that money. Changing the structure in which NPR does their business. As Mr. Lamborn said, looking at that business model, this is a step that we can take to save those taxpayer dollars. This is a step that is going to change that business model and free NPR. Now, contrary to what some across the aisle are saying, this doesn't take NPR off the air. What this does is to say, NPR, you got to get out of the taxpayer's pocket, because the taxpayer is not going to allow those taxpayer dollars to be spent to pay those NPR dues and to buy that NPR programming. Now, another misconception that seems to be out there is about jobs. And saying that programming is going to be denied because these stations won't be able to use taxpayer money to acquire some of this government NPR programming. Let me tell you, what we're doing is empowering these local radio stations, and I hope, Mr. Speaker, that our colleagues understand this. We are turning to these local affiliates and saying, look, there are still going to be grants out there. You can create your own programming. This is a great jobs program for these local radio stations. This is telling them you don't have to buy programming you don't want and that your listeners really don't want to listen to. We're saying get creative. Get that American spirit to work, just as Mr. Crawford was talking program. You want to talk about the jobs that are created? Every time you create a new radio show, you've got a writer, an editor, a producer, a director, a sound engineer, a sound tech, a systems engineer. You've got post-production work to take place. You've got a host. You've got a call screener. You've got a board operator. You've got a research assistant working with that writer and working with that editor. You've got a sales and marketing team working. You've got advertisers that are looking, of course, NPR calls them sponsors. You have affiliate relation teams that are working, and you also have attorneys who are working on the intellectual property to make certain that they protect that content. So I would just encourage my colleagues across the aisle to remember, this is about freeing up those local radio stations. It is about getting NPR out of the taxpayer pocket. It is making certain that we are good stewards of the taxpayer money, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from California.
I would just like to add something here, and that is that one of the mantras of our friends on the other side of the aisle was, read the bill. If the gentlewoman from Tennessee would read the bill, she would know that there's not one dime, not 1 cent that is saved in this bill. And what this bill does is, you can talk all you want about NPR and how much you love it, but what you're doing is you're killing off the local stations from being able to have the money to buy NPR's programming. So you're hurting local broadcasting. I now would like to call on the distinguished woman from California, from the Santa Barbara area, valued member of the committee, Congresswoman Lois Capps.
For how long are you yielding
for
time?
2 minutes.
The gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the ranking member of the committee, and Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this effort to defund public radio. Right now, millions of Americans tune in to NPR stations across the country for one reason: the consistency of the high quality of its programming. In a world awash by often ill-informed and sensationalist cable news and ever louder voices, public broadcasting provides thoughtful, even-handed analysis of the issues of the day. And they do it every day. The bill before us seeks to end that. It is nothing more than an effort to cripple NPR by crippling our local public radio stations. The bill would decimate local NPR stations by restricting their ability to choose programming best suited to their community. In my district, NPR stations like KCLU, KCRW, and KCBX provide valuable international and domestic news. They bring All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and Car Talk into our cars and our living rooms. But these stations also cover local news, concerts, and local and school events. They produce shows like Ears on the Arts, Community Calendar, and From Ballet to Broadway. The bill throws all that out the window. NPR reports and media coverage are consistently even-handed, driven by a high standard of journalistic ethics. They are not politically biased. NPR lets the stories do the talking, not the commentators. And apparently the public, the taxpaying public, likes that. According to the Pew Project for Excellence in Journalism, in the last year, the television network's audience slipped 3.5%. Newspapers were down 5%. Radio fell 6%. Magazines were down almost 9%. NPR, up 3%. Since 2000, NPR's audience is up 58%. In the last year, its website, npr.org, drew an average of 15.7 million unique monthly visitors, up more than 5 million visitors. This is a reflection of the quality of its program and its dedication to its mission. Public broadcasting helps educate our society, celebrates the arts, education, respectful debate, and civil discourse. NPR and the 900-plus local stations are a valuable resource for our country. I urge my colleagues to stand up for public broadcasting and oppose this legislation. I yield back.
Gentlelady from California reserves the balance of her time. Gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to take just a moment, and since the previous speaker talked a little bit about NPR and its listening audience, I would like to make certain that the record reflects a little bit about that listening audience. We know that more men than women listen to NPR, except for the classical music, which is 48% female. Baby boomers are a big part of their audience. We also know that NPR, according to their website, says that their audience is extraordinarily well educated. Nearly 65% of all listeners have a bachelor's degree, compared to only a quarter of the U.S. population. We also know that they are wealthy listeners, Mr. Speaker. NPR households tend to be more affluent than other households, primarily as a result of their educational attainment. The median household income of an NPR News listener is about $86,000, compared to the national average of about $55,000. We also know that when it comes to geography, more than 99% of the U.S. population has access to at least one NPR station. And then when it comes to employment, the majority of NPR listeners, 63%, are employed full-time. Mr. Speaker, again, I repeat the point. The object of this today is to get NPR out of the taxpayer's pocket. It is time for us to do this. It is time for this structure to be changed. It is time for us to be good stewards and save the money of the American taxpayer. This is another step toward that goal, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from California.